ITU and SPIDER was voted in 2006. And as Patricia already mentioned, this is about ensuring that all countries have full access to and develop the capacity to use all types of space-based technology. So it's Earth observation data, it's global navigation, satellite systems, satellite communications, and of course combined with geoinformation to support the full disaster management cycle. And when we mean full disaster management cycle, it's all the different phases of disaster management, starting with that study of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, looking at early
thermal scarring, which means there's been a fire that has destroyed some of the homes, as well as probably homes of the folks that were farmers producing here. And then on the right, several months later, this is the same area, and you can see this incredible change in vegetation, which indicates that this community is no longer habitated. And so, one, that means that there's been displacement and that population may require assistance, and it can lead to further questions about where have they gone and how can we better support them. And then two, this also has serious implications for the agricultural production in this area just to explain this a little bit more, it may seem counterintuitive that, it looks like there's lots of vegetation, that's great, but actually that's overgrowth, and that's a sign that the fields and the community hasn't been tended to. I'll end on a last example on the next slide, please, of infectious disease surveillance. And this I like to think of as kind of a Jon Snow from space. Jon Snow was the scientist that uncovered the source of cholera in London at the pump. So this is kind of a classic epidemiology example that we enjoy and focus on in public health. So with several different remote sensing indicators, we can conduct this remote sensing epidemiology. So indicators that are important for infectious disease spread, and in this case, we can talk specifically about cholera, but this can be changes in population. So, and especially when people are on the move and may not have access to clean water, the latrines. And so the first thing we use remote sensing for is to look at how is displacement changing? So how quickly are camps growing? Are new camps appearing? And what are some of the qualities or conditions that we're seeing even remotely in these camps? The second piece is to try to locate that. So sometimes we'll see, as I showed in the last slide, that a village has been abandoned, and we need to figure out where these populations have moved to. All the way on the right, we can see, so the middle is a cemetery or a graveyard, and then on the right we can see a really unusual increase in grave activity. And in this particular case, it's because of a cholera outbreak, or most likely consistent with burial activity that we would expect to see after a cholera outbreak. For cholera as well, we can use high-resolution satellite imagery to actually see flooding and standing water that's close to some of these camps, and also even latrines that have, for example, been tipped over and are now, the standing water is mixing with the latrines, which for cholera would be a very, very high-risk situation. And this lets us help partners that are on the ground think about where should we be directing cholera testing, for example, as well as any potential interventions, supplies such as bleach, and things like that. And so just in summary, again, we've talked through several different ways that we combine different data streams in order to better inform response, and then also rebuilding across contexts and as well as emergencies, including infectious disease outbreaks, infrastructure problems, and then also agricultural shortcomings. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Danny. And thank you all for outlining the extraordinary resources that your respective agencies and missions are undertaking in some of the most dire human situations. Truly, your work is life-saving. And I'm very grateful to have you assembled as experts here. With that foundation, I'd like to dive deeper into some of the specific scenarios and applications and challenges. And I'll start with some questions that have come to my mind as moderator. But don't forget that you have an opportunity to ask your own questions. Again, you can do this by clicking on the bottom of your screen to the Q&A button and then type in your question. We'll get to as many as we can during a subsequent session. Let's start the Q&A with you, Laurent. I understand that, in your comments, you alerted to emergencies having distinct phases. whether it's a man-made crisis or a natural disaster. Could you please walk us through the different activities and requirements of those phases? Pre-positioning and preparations maybe first, and then what happens in the first 24 to 48 hours after a crisis, and then the sort of active and maybe more organized relief effort phase, and then finally, as you had mentioned, the longer term recovery phases. I'm sure these affect every one of your work, but I'll turn to Laurent to maybe help us understand how each of these are distinct and how satellite resources, whether data or communications, are being used differently. Laurent, can you help us out with that?
Thank you. Yes, thanks, Patricia. And indeed, I mean, as you saw in one of my slides describing that full cycle of disaster management, you have those different phases, as you mentioned. And obviously, satellite technology is useful in all of them in one way or the other. I mean, if you take, for example, the hazard mapping, the risk assessments, right? You definitely need high resolution data imagery to make those to produce those risk maps, for example, or look at the various hazards. You need satellite derived elevation data, 3D data to have simulations about what a flash flood might mean or how flooding would develop or evolve depending on the amount of water coming down. You need to, of course, at the same time, in a preparatory phase, in a preparedness phase, look at collecting various imagery data, what we call baseline. This is especially important for radar imagery. You have to have a baseline so that you can then map floods or other phenomena when a disaster happens. You need a baseline, and very often we don't have that, especially with radar sensors, especially with high-resolution radar sensors. So you have to look at that baseline build-up of satellite imagery, especially in vulnerable areas. We are also looking at how GNSS is useful in this context, and we have some very interesting examples where GNSS devices, in a way, GNSS receivers on the ground, which are deployed for totally different purposes for navigation positioning, are used to actually detect atmospheric waves, following a tsunami, for example, or so basically using one satellite technology for something completely different. Now that would require positioning more of these GNSS receivers on the ground and increasing the density of those receivers so that we can use that technology, for example, in detecting waves or tsunamis as they develop. So this is all part of positioning, collecting data, building baselines in advance. You can also deploy telecommunications devices to be prepared for a situation where the terrestrial networks would go down after a disaster. That again is yet another technology. When it comes to the first 24 hours after disaster, you have to make that assessment, what it is about, what do we need, what information do we need rapidly. And then most of the time it's about collecting imagery as much as possible in all the different spectra, be it optical, radar, or hyperspectral, to analyze, to see what happened, to try and have a rapid impact assessment, sometimes even before crews are deployed on the ground or even before drones could be flown in the area. So this, we have many examples in the past where rapid imagery collection helped us assess the initial damage and what might be the needs. Deploying, of course, telecommunications devices should it be needed. So this scramble of the first 24, 48 hours is all about trying to throw all the assets you can at the problem you face. After that, as it comes to more regular response, you look at collecting the right types of information, feeding that data and feeding the imagery to the teams on the ground, depending on their needs, depending on what the disaster management entities request from you. And then going to recovery, again, their satellite imagery is very useful in tracking recovery, tracking the investments in recovery, looking at how the reconstruction, rebuilding projects are evolving. Many of our sister UN agencies who make these investments and manage these projects want to look at satellite imagery on a frequent basis to just track that recovery process and how the habitat or the areas damaged are rebuilding and how the situation changes. So it's just in a nutshell, basically talking about Earth observation, telecommunication, navigation, all at the service of the full cycle of disaster management. And again, I can talk about these for hours. I stop there, but happy to follow up. Thank you.
I resonate with the throwing all the resources at it as much as you can in those most chaotic hours. And I also thought it was great to hear how you're still learning how you can stretch or repurpose some traditional familiar resources like the GNSS receivers, the GPS, the GLONASS, the Baidu receivers for new purposes. I wanted to give Rebecca and Luca a chance to see if there's anything that's different in the scenarios that you work on in the environments. If there's anything you want to add to that, and then I have a question for Danny to touch on. So Rebecca or Luca, anything you'd add to what Laurent painted for us?
Yes, I'll start then. Let me probably let's have a look at this. Let me share 1 second this time frame. Because definitely time is critical, of course, to provide efficient response, right? And early stages of major or sudden onset disasters are generally characterized by limited, incomplete, and often contradictory information of unknown accuracy that is often related to geographic scope, severity of the event, location of the affected population, priority areas of intervention, and also the operational environment in general, such as the coordination capacity, service location, security, and humanitarian access. Those are very important factors that need to be taken into account. So within the first hours after the disaster event, the availability of post-disaster satellite imagery plays a critical role in providing a rapid and good enough, as we call it, good enough preliminary exposure or impact analysis to support evidence-based operational planning and decision-making. Data, and of course, I believe that we all agree that data information is the foundation, a stone on which the decision-making and coordination in emergency response are based in general. And of course, the remote sensing is critical in providing timely and reliable information about the situation on the ground, particularly in most affected and hard to reach areas, especially when the actors and the field teams cannot access those areas. So, fully aligned with the humanitarian program cycle, the UNOSAT emergency mapping service is a well-established and predictable mechanism for a humanitarian organization to request a full range of satellite-derived product, as shown in this slide here, upon a request, our service deliver evidence-based information for preliminary situation awareness within the 24 hours, rapid impact analysis within the 48 or 72 hours, and then later on, as soon as very high resolution satellite imagery is available, we also provide very detailed damage assessment. Of course, all our analysis is based on satellite imagery, and then we take advantage of a wide range of optical and radar satellite imagery from commercial and scientific sensors. We are not using any military data, from very high resolution, 15, 30 centimeters, up to low resolution data, of course. There are lots of different constellations. And the sources of our imagery are free and open data platform, commercial vendors, and especially for sudden onset disaster, we rely on the international charter space and major disasters, which is, for those that are not familiar with, is an agreement between 17 different space agencies who provide for free pre- and post-disaster images from 270 different sensors from 35 constellations following major disaster events. So this imagery are given, are shared with what they call authorized users, including UNOSAT, who then can use this imagery for analysis. And then all the satellite-derived analysis is shared amongst the different users. UNOSAT, of course, in the charter, as mentioned also by Laurent earlier, we are taking the role of PM or value adding as long as with other along with other mapping organization, and then we are really one of the major contributors to this mechanism.
Amazing. So that is definitely helping to round this out. But Rebecca, from UNHCR's perspective, I'd be interested to know whether these phases and sort of application approaches translate similarly to population movement of refugees and displacement situations, or are they different from emergency management? How are you looking at these satellite capabilities and which are especially critical for refugee protection?
Of course, no. I mean, we use the same phases: preparedness, 24 to 72 hours aftermath, and then reconstruction. But I think what it looks like as a practitioner is that you're in the crisis, and I agree with you that sometimes it's a contradictory look at information, and at the same time, it's a flood of information. So everyone wants to get in, everyone has something to contribute, and we're very gracious that UNITAR, for example, is the one that is coordinating a lot of the space information, but there's also commercial agreements, and so as a humanitarian, what you need to do is to coordinate with the other agencies, so divide and conquer, right? And so that's what happens. So whenever you are there, then everyone gets their mandate on, and then we try to share as much as information as possible to see and debunk those duplications and no potential misinformation, which is like contradictions, or maybe you do that. And the first thing that we do, and this is the important part for us in preparedness, how does that look like? We always have some baseline data and baseline assessments. And we do it normally on a day-to-day basis with the home visits, trying to understand where the population was concentrated at the beginning. As you were saying, like we understand and we know where our communities are. And I think this is one of the strengths of the agency. We are in close contact with our population, right? So for urban planning, for settlement planning, for aftermath disaster, we usually used to have a baseline of the population, and many of the agencies relied on a baseline to say, okay, there were the population more or less here, and this happened, right? The conflict, the bomb, or the flood, or the earthquake in what happened to us in Syria and Turkey. And we are the ones sometimes sharing the information and then sharing, getting back some of this information for us to be able to give this baseline. So that's the importance of having a population baseline at the beginning, or some sort of baseline with infrastructure, with environmental elements, with the clinics, et cetera, et cetera. In the aftermath, as I was saying, that we need to put the coordination in place. And also, why? Because the important thing is the prioritization of the aid, right? You would like to distribute at anything, but as well they mentioned, we might not have access. That area might be very perilous to go in. And so the important part is, like, for example, the route planning, prioritizing areas, and maybe the population that we can save the most, that are critical of be saving. So it could be life-saving in the 72 hours, right? And then finally, I think on the reconstruction, things that they didn't mention, but for us it's also important for example, for potential expansion and to avoid things happening in the future, right? So if there is a flood, a drought, things that we're having, for example, for damage of infrastructure, you can actually have even more damage in the aftermath because the infrastructure is weak and it can actually collapse, right? So that actually help us to do assessments on like areas where they can actually be living. So in the case of IDPs, and remembering Syria when we're working there, like we be able to have that baseline data, and in comparison to what happened, to be able to do reconstruction and recovery, and again, prioritize the areas that you're going to reconstruct in the future. Everything at the end is about prioritization. The resources are not unlimited. So this is the importance of having the space data, right? So like you actually are able to distribute aid where it's needed the most.
It strikes me too, all of your agencies are using these satellite resources not only to improve the actual response, but also to amplify what your relatively small, hardy groups are able to approach and attack from a workforce perspective. There aren't that many of you, and there are a lot of scenarios around the world that are looking for your help. I did want to ask Danny, from a research perspective, it's clear that there are decision makers in certain countries around the world that are relying on satellite imagery and geospatial analysis, either directly or in tandem with the expertise and assistance of these UN agencies. Do you see? Is it the countries that have had a crisis that are familiar and reliant, using these tools to good effect, or how are the actual decision makers approaching the access to and the awareness of these tools for evidence-based decisions on either population health science or during the different phases of humanitarian emergencies? How do they find out about this?
So our work might be a bit unique at Yale because folks are familiar with the different emergencies that we're active in. And so we actually get pretty regularly requests for support. Everything from we want to move a convoy here. I think Rebecca mentioned it. Is this a safe, how does this route look? And those are very real-time pieces of evidence that we can contribute. And then more long-term, when we start to think about those patterns and how can we identify risk factors for particular events happening, or whether or not something is happening, there's a statistically significant difference, whether it's in agriculture or access to healthcare. And by that, I mean, is the difference we're seeing possible that it's just random, or does it look like there's something going on here that will certainly have an important impact on population health, access to care, access to food, and that can lead us to start thinking about what those next steps might be, kind of almost an anticipatory situation mid-crisis of another compounding crisis. And I would also add that we have all of the space data, and our team pairs it with another stream of data, the open source information. And a lot of that comes through partnerships with folks on the ground. So everywhere we work, we've got some close partnerships with local organizations providing aid, as well as different sources of information. And by doing that, that stream of data informs our space data stream, and in the same way, the space data stream then informs our open source or OSINT stream, and we're able to merge those together, kind of this fusion process, which keeps us really close to folks on the ground. And the way that a lot of my colleagues have described, they have their own teams on the ground at Yale. We don't necessarily have that, but we do have really close partnerships so that we could be responsive to needs as well.
So I have the sense that many of you and your agencies have worked together, and I in fact, maybe I should give each of you a chance to weigh in on how your services are made known. And I'm sure that some of these scenarios are a crisis triggers need, and then the UN steps in with all your assembled resources. Are there other ways for those in the audience or that are listening where they've been lucky enough not to need you yet, but is there a way that you help to onboard them? I know for Spider that's likely the case, but I'd be interested in knowing, how do you make your incredible resources known to those who haven't yet been put in the position of dire need? Rebecca, why don't you give that a shot, and then I'll turn to Laurent and Luca if you have things to add.
Absolutely. No, I think what it happens is that we establish a lot of partnerships, right? So, and that was one of my later points, which is we don't have all the technical resources, nor the actual technical space, Earth observation capacity on the ground. So as you were saying, we're a few of us that actually can understand an image that has been tasked and maybe dissected, right? So we do have some very good GIS experts, our GIS team actually, but there's so few of them in whenever the crisis strikes. So this is where they rely on partnerships. So yes, for example, in our case, I think our broker is UNOSAT and UNITAR. And so, for example, their Copernicus program was super helpful. So there was one question, I think, in the panel on like, how do we work on coordination, especially with the exclusion of disasters? Actually, we work on a specific conflict cooperation agreements where some satellite specific countries cooperate with UNITAR And UNOSAT is the one providing us the imagery, right? And if the image was tasked, right, or it was taken at some point. And we're very lucky when it is, because the other ones are the clouds, right? Start laughing, satellite people, but we endure the clouds when it was like, oh no, we're trying to be the baseline in between this, and there's a cloudy image. So if that is the case, then we rely on other sources. No, so yes, establishing cooperation agreements. WMO also is a huge I would say agency that establishes a lot of support.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's the cooperation among agencies. So whoever has the information, then we will go and piggyback the cooperation agreement.
I think if we tried to tap in all the UN agencies that have a hand to lend or resources to contribute, we would have had a massive, maybe unending panel. So you all are representatives here of a much bigger crowd, is clear. Laurent, is there anything you want to add about how Spider, is it all based on requests? Do you reach out? How do countries find out about the more technical resources that you and Luke, I'll ask you the same for UNOSAT?
Yeah, I think it's mostly based on requests. It's also a function of us not being able or not having the capacity and the size to promote ourselves and then sell ourselves too much. We are happy to satisfy the requests we receive and address those that come. Countries learn from one to the other through the different committee meetings within the UN, where the work that we are doing is reported and official reports are presented, and then they reach out. And very often, I would say there's still this impression among us that there is no technical capacity in those countries to work with the data and with these technologies, and that we have to support them from outside. In fact, in the last 10 years, this changed a lot. And everywhere I go around the world, I meet very good experts in remote sensing GIS sitting in the disaster management entity, sitting in the Ministry of Environment. What they don't have is awareness of where to find the data, or they don't have the resources to access the data, especially the very high resolution commercial data. I'm not talking about what's freely available that everybody can access. But when it comes to the very high resolution commercial data, that becomes a lot more complicated. And there are generous gestures by governments such as Norway, making data available through initiatives such as NICFI, where Planet data was licensed for the whole intertropical region of the world for free for any user. But guess what? Last year, a few months ago, when I was in Tonga, I brought together 26 disaster management experts from 11 island states who have a workshop on Earth observation technologies, and then nobody knew about NICFI being freely available, and most of those islands are in fact covered by the data. All they needed was someone to tell them, and they happily jumped on it. So there's a lot of lack of awareness. We need to address that. We need to build the capacity that might not exist. We do that through working with the countries, to going to those countries, as I showed you in my slides earlier, on assessing their capacities and their gaps through these advisory missions. And then we address them one by one as we can. I think there's a lot of data technology that we can kind of offer and facilitate access to. It's just a matter of doing it smart. As UN, we also negotiate with providers, satellite imagery providers, commercial providers, license discounts, multi-agency sharing, licensing improvements, volume discounts that can again make it cheaper and easier for countries to access that data. And that's another big job we have to do in the background to bring down the cost of accessing and owning the data. I think, to me, if we can do more progress on these tracks, then we look at a much brighter future in terms of accessing data, at least, especially with the increasing number of providers and imagery collection entities, hundreds now, not 2, 3 like in the past. Yeah.
Well, it's really good to hear that you're finding more interest and kind of homegrown expertise on space-based imagery and these kinds of resources. I'm going to take a little bit of credit on behalf of the space and satellite industry. We've been doing what we can to make space, cool and interesting. So hopefully that's driving more at home, interest and intrigue about it. But I might also suggest, and I'll talk internally with the ITU team that wanted to showcase these services in this panel, to think about other ways that we might be able to amplify, particularly for the telecom and for that community, to make sure that they know that these resources exist for their counterpart agencies at home. We may be able to help a little more, to at least gather together some of the information that we have here. And I will say that this video and the slide presentations that you've all shared will be put up online afterwards, and we'll be driving people to pay attention to those as well. Luca and Rebecca, I wanted to ask you the same question that really started with Danny and has moved over to Laurent and now to you. How do people find out about you, and how do countries, are they usually tapped in because they have found themselves in a position of need, or is this word of mouth? Is it your outreach? Luca, why don't you give me a quick sense of that for UNOSAT, and then we'll turn to you, Rebecca.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, of course, the end users of our emergency mapping service are in general all humanitarian entities operating in line with UN policies for international humanitarian assistance. Of course, we work a lot with all UN agencies, with the Red Cross, with I4C, and also with all the international humanitarian organizations. And then we, as the others, we also work upon a request. So our service can be activated by all these actors, let's say. And as soon as we receive a request, we look into the request, the area of interest, the priority area of interest, the type of event, and the analysis that is required. And then, of course, the main, as I mentioned, is we have to trigger different type of mechanism to collect the imagery. But then, once the imagery, once the analysis is ready, we share all analysis through different means. We have we share through mailing list. It's available on our website, on the Space Charter website, but also in other platform like the HDX, the Humanitarian Data Exchange Platform, which is a very standard also not only to collect analysis or satellite analysis, but also all the baseline that are very essential and critical to provide this type of product. All our products are also free of charge and are available in different formats, because one of the main things is that sometimes people in the field don't have time to process or the capacity to process a huge amount of satellite imagery, so that we do the work from remote for them. And what we share is basically the GIS-ready data, so they can integrate our satellite analysis into their own framework. I'd like just to give to everybody also a quick, maybe practical way, because one important aspect I'd like to emphasize here is the coordination aspect. As it was mentioned by the colleagues earlier, it's important, really important to coordinate among the different, mapping groups. And then if I might just show you, this is disabled. Okay,
I don't think no more slides. I don't think at this point.
No more, I wanted to share. Well, that was really practical, because UNOSAT has been implementing. We implemented this satellite mapping coordination system, which is one of the coordination tools available on the GDAX website, which is the Global Disaster Alert Coordination System. Some of our audience, maybe they might know. And within the GDAX, there is this SMCS platform website where all humanitarian actors, all agencies, all disaster managers can look and understand, who is doing what and where in terms of satellite images. So this is very important and critical to understand in this specific area of interest, who is doing it. Is there anybody is doing analysis? And if yes, what type of analysis they are going to produce. So, and this will allow for the disaster mapping groups not to duplicate any efforts, and for the users to understand what type of analysis they might be getting and when. So this is a very important tool that allows us to coordinate better in terms of responding effectively, and then also to improve horizontal coordination amongst the mapping groups. Thank you.
Great. And I'll just say the slides that you gave us, we'll go ahead and put on the website so folks can reference those.
Or the link, so we can share.
Yeah, the link. Yes. Rebecca, is there anything you want to say about, I'm assuming for refugee crisis, there's not a lot of countries that are anticipating that until they are anticipating it. Is there any early engagement that you do, or is it engagement at the moment?
No, this is, as you said, there's obviously early engagements in countries or bordering countries whenever you see that there's a potential conflict arising, right? And there's some protracted situations that the border, like, the neighboring countries are super, we call them the host countries, are super gracious, and they know, and they usually coordinate with the agency, especially the counterparts, the governments, local authorities, and border authorities, no? And you're saying, how do they know about us? We're the leads of the 3 clusters in the emergencies. I don't know, in emergencies, for those who are not humanitarians, whenever a disaster or a conflict strike, the agencies divide themselves to lead one specific service or aid delivery, right? And for us, and according to the cluster, for example, UNICEF as WASH, we have protection, of course, so shelter and camp coordination and camp management, right? I mean, we're the logo of the humanitarian agencies or the shelter agency. So in support of shelter is with IFRC, in camp coordination and camp management, sometimes with IOM, depending on the situation, IDPs, etc. So humanitarian agencies know us that we usually have the baseline data of the population. So in case, and for some who have never seen it, I was telling you, we have the MAPS team, the GIS team, that usually coordinate with probably the Spider team and UNOSA team and all the teams that are working, which are in charge, and I put poster in the chat for everyone to have it, in charge of having the layers, the GIS layers that are the most up to date with the population, with the presence of the agency, the offices, etc. So they know when the disasters strike, and they know in advance as well because of some of the analysis that we do, and you can find some of the policy analysis in our website. And then, of course, because the own countries are the ones that are actually leading some of these efforts. It's not UNHCR the one driving it. It's the countries that are very concerned on what's happening in their country and or what could happen potentially in theirs. So approaching the agency, and we're an agency that's where I was telling you, we're proud to be located in 130 countries, right? With the whole financial situation in the UN, we're unfortunately closing some offices. So this is what the concern is, like the displacement is not stopping. Conflict actually is increasing, and we might be able not to serve as much as we used to, but this is why we're relying on other observations to be able to have better analysis in that sense.
Excellent. It is reassuring and interesting to know how much is just a practice that isn't transparent to those of us who aren't humanitarian practitioners or emergency disaster managers, and that just is the structure that you all have built up as a practice. The disaster sites that I've had a chance to see are just a beehive of activity with all kinds of international agencies, national government forces, not-for-profit relief efforts, all pitching in. We don't see the order that I think and sort of structure that is typically brought in to help with the chaos. But I am intrigued with 2 questions. One of them is these satellite resources. How are they shared across all these different kinds of users? UN agencies, national government forces, and as you mentioned, Rebecca, potentially of multiple countries, and then the not-for-profit NGOs that are also providing assistance. How are those shared? And then, Laurent, you mentioned some of the contracts that Spider has with satellite providers. I think, Luca, you did too. I'll be interested to know, who ends up being the buyer? And then how does that coordination work with other groups? Laurent, can you help us with that, since you sort of teased that in your comments?
Yes, yeah. No, and this is not about Spider, this is about the United Nations as a whole.
Yep.
So these contracts are usually negotiated at the New York level by the UN Procurement Division based on guidance and input from us as UN entities who require access to the data. That's how they, let's say, are born. But sometimes it takes a year or 2 even to put in place one such contract that then all the UN system can use to make the data procurement a bit more how should I say, efficient, reduce the cost, use those volume discounts across the system and all that. So that's one way of doing it. Now, in those contracts, we try to negotiate as advantageous as possible sharing and conditions, let's put it that way, or the so-called multi-agency licensing model that we apply very often with some companies, and I won't mention specific companies, not to promote or advertise anybody here, but we have conditions such as if you buy with a multi-agency license, that image product can be shared with all UN system entities and with up to 5 government entities in the country concerned. So that in itself is already making a lot easier the data sharing part. Because a lot of the waste of energy, overhead, time, and money that we have is buying individually, buying, for specific projects. It happens all the time, but never considering sharing that across the system or with other, ministries or institutions in the country affected that we are targeting with our projects. So this is a huge improvement by just thinking like that and using the provisions of these contracts to purchase data. Now, who's the buyer? Well, it could be a UN entity who's supporting a specific project. It could be a project itself managed by multiple entities that has money to purchase data for specific purposes. But we can always think about how to invest in this data so that it's easier shareable and you can pass it on to other users as well. And then very often, of course, it could be a peacekeeping operation, or it could be a World Food Program, or it could be a UNDP project in a country. But if you buy smart, you can easier share that. And that's, I think, the biggest advantage. We are proposing now also a so-called imagery purchase coordination unit within the UN, and then our office is championing that to put this in place, because there's up to 40 different UN entities making data purchases and investments, and only within the UN system. I'm not talking about NGOs and all the others out there. And this is very, very how should I say, inefficient sometimes, and that's a huge challenge, especially that in the past we were doing business, as we say, with 3-4 providers, the usual suspects. Now potentially we have 50 or 100. We are here at Living Planet Symposium. It's happening next door in Vienna. We have our committee section. Every hour of my days in the last week was about meeting with different companies who are coming and wanting to talk to us about launching new constellations and offering us data and imagery. We need to have agreements in place with all of them, because that increases our capacity to access the data, or potential to access data on an hourly basis over any spot on Earth. But if we don't have those agreements in place, then it's just wishful thinking. So I think it's, no matter who the buyer is, it's about being smart in licensing and sharing the data. I think that's the most important.
All right. If anyone has something to add, Danny, anything you want to add, or Luke or Rebecca? It sounds like this is common data and commonly shared. That's really not the impediment anyway. Am I missing something there, or is that generally the case? I see nods. I was going to ask. I should also say, I mentioned earlier trying to help to promote both the incredible services that you all offer, but also just the capabilities that the ITU's Development Bureau has been training and educating member states for around the globe on emergency technologies and best practices for responses. And we'll make sure that this is socialized through their community as well. I want to ask, and maybe I'll start with Danny. Laurent mentioned the sort of, we don't use the word explosion in the satellite world, but the proliferation of satellite projects, constellations, technologies, and capabilities. And for those of you who are laser focused on the output of those capabilities, of those new projects, those new missions, what are you looking forward to? What do you hope that the satellite industry delivers to you that you don't have now?
I think there are really two things here. So in this kind of wealth of new data streams and data sources, we often are still building bespoke models for each crisis, each setting. That some of it is inherent to the problem. For example, thermal anomaly detection, we may not need everywhere. But what would help us expand our work greatly and our impact would be to have the ability or the capacity to have a way to pull all these data sources together
Yeah.
in a way that can be simply refined for a particular crisis rather than starting with from scratch. When we so at the university, we work on specific projects. And so when we have a specific project come in, we build the whole thing from scratch. And so I think that on that support for that end of the synthesis piece is perhaps not as super exciting, but it would make a world of difference in terms of the speed and how quickly the data can be used. And so I think that's very exciting. And I also am looking forward to validating the use of the different tools together. I think there can be a lot of, well, this tool has this limitation or this tool has this limitation. And rather than see it that way, when we start to pull them in together efficiently, then we can really capitalize on the strengths and understand those limitations too at the same time. So I'm interested in more validation studies and also building out platforms where we can really pull this data in real time and then just tweak it for different scenarios. Thank you.
I'll note in a little plug of the ITU. They're in about 2 weeks, they'll be holding a huge conference, like 10,000 people on artificial intelligence called AI for Good. And I'll be moderating a panel on 2 panels on space. And one of them is how AI is being employed to try and manage and analyze the vast amounts of remote sensing and Earth imagery data that's being collected from the growing number of satellite assets on orbit. And I had saw a quote recently that I thought was especially apt, that we are rapidly reaching the point that we can't make sense of what we sense. And I think that's where AI, I think, is a huge tool. I don't know, Rebecca, I know you have an interest in AI in this. Do you have anything you want to add about that as we mention this? And by the way, the AI for Space panels that we're doing within this conference will be live streamed as part of this Space Connect series. So hopefully we'll be able to continue and pick up on some of these themes. Rebecca, anything you want to add about AI on this?
Yes.
And is it a tool for you?
Absolutely. Actually, as data scientist is kind of my main area of research, and I'll see you in ITU, AI for Good for sure, because we will be present there. I think AI is a game changer for data analytics. Not that it would never at some point replace humans. I always joke with my team, you're never going to be replaced because your technical skills are very specialized, especially for the people on Earth observations, people that are doing tasking, labeling of the imagery. But you're always could be substituted by someone that knows to use AI, right? So if they know and understand how to use AI, then that can be substitute UI, because, for example, tasking or labeling imagery, which needs to be done by humans at the beginning, maybe can be continued once you have built the classification models with AI, right? So AI can help you to do some analysis faster. It can give you classify infrastructure or structures that you see faster in a way. Of course, a human need to build a model and actually give them labeling of the things. So that's for more on modeling. It actually can give you the results also faster in some places, some conclusions or analysis, and what the model is anticipating to have, right? You would need always to have a ground truthing and cross-validation. So you would need the expert human to tell you, okay, yeah, the model made a mistake here. And we have worked in the past with 2 specific projects. And one was with UN Global Pulse and UNOSAT actually on settlement growth, mapping settlement growth, and is also understanding a bit the infrastructure for the ceilings and all the infrastructure specifically in the camps, so to understand if it was like, for example, a refugee setting or it was a host community. Sometimes they're like together, right? And it's pretty distinctive. Our tents, they have like a square meter and a color in some cases, so you can distinguish them from above. And that is helpful to understand. But the classification and the imagery is the speed on the analysis is the thing that actually is very promising if you think about it. Nevertheless, I'm an advocate for the human in command approach, which is humans will always need to cross-check and cross-check. I think it's just the cumbersome task that humans need to do manually, like editing, like that actually AI has great potential for satellite Earth observation and other space technology. And yes, like it's not only on refugee settlements obviously for us is roof density detection and roof and population movement, but I think for flood mapping, drought, things that exacerbate forced displacement, so actually exacerbate the movement of people are things that are also going to be needed, and AI is a game changer for space technology on this. So yeah, like I think it's something that maybe GIS teams are already learning, basics of machine learning, especially for imagery classification. Computer vision is the part of AI that is actually in charge of this analysis of imagery. I think more and more there are scientific panels and or people that are growing companies, startups that are working in this tiny niche space, which is computer vision with a specific satellite imagery. Because yes, the reflection of the air, in sometimes you don't have a perfect like photo, right? So you need to have, cleaning the data and actually doing some additional editing and tasking. I'm actually butchering your terms, guys, because I've been working with you. No, yes, like I've been working with you when they were telling me, then a deer that is happening. So like the reflection on the earth, so it's moved actually. So whenever I see you, I'm fascinated by it. And my only expertise is machine learning, which is what I actually do, which is trying to understand is that, okay, is there a way to do this faster? Because we really need it for yesterday when we have the aftermath of the response. No? So that is life-changing and game-changer for humanitarian response on the speed that we need the data to be analyzed.
Amazing. And actually that links very well to a question that we got from the audience in the chat. And this, Luca, this one's for you. And it says, in your slides, it appeared that there were some products that integrated information from multiple sources. To what extent, and this is really just building on what Danny said, to what extent is the information derived only automation, and to what extent is it the result of human analysis? What's the split in your experience? Are the integrated products produced by human input or all automation? Can you help us with that, Luca? What in your lane? And don't forget to take yourself off mute.
I was muted. Can you hear me now? Yeah, perfect.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we are very, very active in applied research and innovation. And then we are partnering with other UN agencies, academic institutions, and private sectors to test new innovative applications. And then especially looking at AI and machine learning algorithms and trying to integrate them into operational context. So it's something that we have been doing. And then on that note, it's been now 5 years that we developed this AI-based model for automatic detection of surface water. It's called the UNOSAT Flood AI, which is a pipeline that able to integrate automatically sentinel data, radar imagery, and then to process all these images, and then that the result is basically flood extent that can be integrated automatically within dashboard with baseline to generate impact statistics about the floods. Though all this dashboard, and we normally integrate into or embed into resident coordinator offices or other end users, they can access easily, and then, automatically update the statistic of a flood events, for example. And this is, as Rebecca mentioned, it's integrating AI into our work, speed up a lot our processing time. Sometimes we can get the flood analysis in certain. This tool is operational in 8 countries, and not everywhere, of course. But then the processing time can be reduced up to 80%. So that is a great achievement, I would say. We are also partnering with UN Global Pulse, WFP, and UNDP and Google and other private sector's partners in a project called DISHA, that is Data Insight for Social and Humanitarian Action. And specifically in that project, we are looking into building an artificial intelligence solution for building damage assessment using very high resolution imagery. And we are, of course, important is also looking at the interagencies, as you mentioned, the ITU AI for Good initiative. It's a very good forum where we can exchange with other partners, and then also the ITU focus group on the use of AI for natural disaster management. So it's very important to keep abreast of all these new technologies. But if I can comment a bit, I will say that sometime when looking at the operational, looking at the very response, or sometimes, if something or an algorithm or a model is not ready to be used everywhere. And the predictability is very important. There are many research centers that come up with very interesting, let's say, innovative AI-based model, I would say, but they're not operational in the country where us or Rebecca and the UNHCR and all the universities are operating. So that's why it's very important to distinguish what is remaining in the research and what can be really used in operational context. Over.
I want to ask, for all of you, one of the questions had to do with whether you have what you need in terms of data. And what we have been looking at is almost having too much data to try and synthesize and make sense of. But there was a question from the chat and saying, what are the biggest limitations you face when relying on existing commercial or national EO data during rapid onset disasters? Where do you need more data, and which data sets do you need more reliable access to? And this is sort of a twist on what we've been talking about, which is how do we make sense of this vast, pipeline of information to be able to make good decisions. Danny, do you want to take this to start? Like, what kind of information are we missing? But if that's not for you, we can ask Laurent or Luca or Rebecca, if you've got anything you'd like to say. Do you have a wish list? Is there something you wish you had?
I mean,
besides the synthesizing that we understand. So this is more about the input, not the managed output.
Well, I think I can tell you that on a daily basis, our team is looking for images over particular areas of interest.
Okay.
We don't always get them, particularly high resolution, very high resolution. So there is inequities in the way that our current constellations get tasked. And so sometimes we will, and then the pay to play game is out of reach for a lot, especially when we talk about supporting those local analysts, as Laurent was mentioning. So there are still many areas of the world that don't have as many images as we'd like. And especially if we know there's an area of interest. And then, of course, the other things such as cloud coverage, things like that can be tricky, that there's nothing you can do about it, but there are all these other sensors that can be used instead. And I also just wanted to say that one of the data sources we haven't mentioned really is the use of telecom. And the way that that's already been used for tracking displacement, for example, after the earthquakes in Haiti and other earthquakes as well. And so having the variety and the agility to pull from those different streams is great. Especially helps us fill in those gaps. But there are some areas that are underrepresented. I'll let my colleagues.
I want to ask Luca and Rebecca quickly. Do you have a wish list of what you would like to ideally have in terms of inputs? And then I saw Laurent, I saw you nodding, so I want to come back to you at the end. Rebecca or Luca, here's your chance. Tell the satellite industry what you need.
Luca, go.
I go first, Rebecca.
Well, what do you want? You're king for a day. What do you want?
Yeah, I go first, quickly. Well, we don't have really a wish list, but I will say that, of course, technological improvement, we are benefit of, there's so many constellations, so we have a lot of data. We have a lot of data, and I believe that we can do a lot of things with this data that will be available, of course. But we are working all, and then Rebecca probably will add on this, in operational context that they are very complex. So it's not about data to me. It's about ensuring that information, whatever information is, sometimes it's not. We don't need a very complex level of information, but we need information to save life. And then disease can be easily obtained with the data information that are available and we can get through in an operation. So I believe that we should be focusing more on the mechanism and then ensuring the coordination amongst the different agencies that are operating in the field, and then with the local government. That is probably where we are still probably lots to improve. Rebecca, over to you. I know that you will add more.
Thank you, Luca. No, in our case, and funny enough, with the new advancements, so for example, we're taking a look at the low Earth orbit, like LEO kind of a style, Starlink satellites, right? And it's not about imagery per se, it's more on connectivity. And so, and you might not think, but this is a part of the new technologies that are being developed by space. And for us, connectivity is a key life-saving element, especially, for example, if aid is digitized, and if you're distributing food and you need a computer and an internet connection at some point, and or like, for example, for even people to ask for help. And there's a lot of shutdowns specifically, and especially in the aftermath of a disaster or conflict, the infrastructure is down, right? Meaning base Earth infrastructure. So this is when you rely on these new technologies, specifically space-based technologies, for us to be able to establish connectivity, reliable internet, where we actually understand where the people need from help, and actually reinforcing that they are independent, right, and not relying on oral health or the connectivity that we provide. And that happens, and we have a specific program in UNHCR Innovation, specifically on connectivity for refugees. And more and more is trying to expand on these two areas, especially device to device and LEO type of this for connectivity specifically. You might not think that it's not very clear, but there could be more potential, not only as services provider, right? So this is something that the companies and service provision should be thinking of. Think of us and the humanitarian space. Over to
that's a good plea. That's a good plea for the satellite industry. And as someone who was, who worked with Starlink from its inception for 6 years or so, we were pleased that the UN, there was a UN project evaluating new technology that reached out to us and wanted to learn about the technology as we were developing and fielding it and testing it. And that was one way to integrate a new capability into, I think, this very meshed support network that you all represent. But I might turn the question a little bit, Laurent, to you. You mentioned, watching the proliferation, not explosion, proliferation of satellite constellations and resources that are being proposed, and in some cases funded, in some cases fielded. But how are you learning about these? Are they coming to you with their shiny new project options, or are you? Is there this group that I used to work with at the UN was an interagency group that was specifically looking at new tools? How would you advise a satellite company? And we've had a couple in chat saying we're building something cool that will help you. How do you want to see them? How do we integrate my people, my satellite brethren, into your community of frontline resources?
Yes, thanks. And then, yes, we are already talking with Common Space about that. So what is in the chat, we are already discussing. And as I mentioned, just this week at Living Planet, most of the industries here from Japan, from Europe, from US, they're all coming and asking for bilateral meetings to discuss, to present their new constellation plans and all that. And also going back to what Danny said, the truth is there's not enough data in the right hands, especially in countries. As I mentioned it before, let's not kid ourselves. It's not yet resolved. But I have a hope that in the next 2-3 years, something big will come compared to the last 20 years. And it's almost an explosion. You like to avoid the word explosion, but I think it's an explosion.
Proliferation. my friend.
Fine, let's make it proliferation. But I am very excited because it's actually giving us the capacity between high resolution SAR and optical and hyperspectral to look at 1 and sub-meter resolution on every spot on Earth, 10, 15 times a day, even day and night. That's just something I was personally in 30 years in this business, but I was dreaming about this. It was science fiction 5, 10 years ago. Now it's coming. Now it's a matter of how we make use of it. So my wish list is onboard processing. It's analytical services. It's the ability of rapid access to the data. But in the end, back to your question, companies come to us. Companies, as soon as they hear about the UN needs and the fact that we have a UN interagency coordination mechanism on geospatial information, the UN Geospatial Network, UN Space. This office is the Secretariat of UN Space. This is an interagency UN coordination network on space activities. These mechanisms are able to broker, to facilitate all these discussions with private sector also. I think we need the private sector to have a dialogue. We need them to present their plans. Sometimes we might even influence those plans. We might make suggestions. Amazon is talking to us, Kuiper, what is there that's missing with Starlink? Can we do something better? And we have plenty of input. So have a dialogue with us as industry, because we have that experience from the ground, and we can provide input, we can provide guidance. And once we know what you offer, then we can consider those contractual arrangements also that might have to come in the future to be able to access the data quickly. We need contracts, we need mechanisms in place to purchase those services or the access. And that's, I think, where we have to have a dialogue, and where we need to know what the industry plans, and then, facilitate, mediate that towards our UN system and sister entities.
It strikes me that, all of the projects that are being conceived of and proposed, whether for Earth imagery or for communications, require spectrum. So at some point, they're all coming to the ITU and their Radio Communications Bureau for the space. And there may be a way that we, one of our follow-ons might be from this conversation, is to see, is there a way that we can help sift through the many emerging ideas in this wildly innovative period in space technology, and make sure that you all know what's coming your way, and also maybe give a feedback loop, as you mentioned, to what you would want. Luca, let me ask you for the technology kind of inflow to you. How do you have a very similar experience to Laurent at UNUSA and Spider about learning about new capabilities that could be of value? Are companies coming to you? Do you hunt them out? Is that something that we can help bridge a little bit?
Well, we, of course, then we are being a UN, it's very important for us to serve as a bridging, between, of course, the private sectors, these commercial companies, but then, and then looking at what's happening and what could be very beneficial for in supporting our and supporting our mandate, and especially providing to our end users, the best and available products we can. That's very important. And as I said, there are many things. There's so many things happening right now in terms of in innovation and innovation that are. But again, to me, the focus here is not looking at how many constellations will be operational in the coming few years. That's, of course, as Laurent said, we something that we were just dreaming, just a few years ago. So what are our concern is how we're going to bring all this stuff in this good innovation into good operational services that can be used, because we can also offer the best product ever. But then if our end users and then the countries, the member states, they don't have a capacity to use it, that is very, is where there is a limit. So I believe that also looking at the entire ecosystem, and especially also looking at the capacity of end users to ingest this technology for the decision making is very important.
Yeah, and I think just as with the challenge of trying to manage an overabundance of satellite data, there may be also a little bit of a challenge in sifting through the many projects and which ones are moving forward and through these complicated phases of funding and manufacturing and launching. But I also maybe wanted to ask, is there anything a company can do as they're working with you to make sure that they're not just like a test article, that they're more able to be integrated into the complex interagency, intergovernmental work that you do and actually be applied in the field? Is there a common denominator for the services or tools from being a cool, shiny object to being something that you can regularly integrate and apply and utilize on the ground? Rebecca, anything you would say there?
I was just thinking of one of the questions, and maybe it's not related, which is like, are they really useful or applicable in all the context, right? And I think this is the most important question, and it's not. In some cases, and also to complement on what you were asking, what do we need? Real-time live data, which is impossible because like space tech is usually a picture of something that happened like a few hours ago. And so, for example, to respond to the question of the colleague saying like if it can help you even control clandestine or cross-border, yes and no, it depends on the operational context. No, so in certain environments, these tools are super valuable, right? They can help you with the cross-monitoring. For example, we have done it with the Sudan conflict. I think it was, thank you, Yunus, at that as well, that we were monitoring the borders between Chad and Sudan, right? And it's because the terrain, the conditions, the clouds are conducive to do that, and then you can actually you have baselines out of it that conflict is protracted, right? But for example, I remember when the team reached out, the Venezuela team, and we wanted to analyze the trochas, which is clandestine underground tunnels. And why? Because it's life-saving. The trochas actually fall down and then they kill people because they're not well built, right? It's not that they have time to build these tunnels. They do it very informally, and we wanted to save the more amount of people that we knew they were crossing at some point, especially after the reopening of the border with Brazil. And in that case, I don't think space observation is useful, right? They're underground tunnels, so you need a combination of other technologies, maybe sensors, UAV, in order to be life-saving, no? So that I think I think the answer to the question is it depends. It depends where it is and the implications, no? And it's challenging. That's why I think it's important that you guys are organizing this kind of discussions, because it's cross functionalities and cross disciplines, right? So many of us are working in a combo of like the space tech, but also maybe some of them, as you well mentioned, they might be sensor experts, they might be computer vision ML experts. So that's something that needs to be taken into account, this cross-functional support.
Danny, anything you would like to add there in terms of, a factor of success between a cool thing that gets shown to you and something that actually yields data that's useful to you or resources that are useful in the field?
I think from the data sources that we do have, it is always helpful to have those like actual conversations about use. And similarly, those conversations on our side need to be informed by people in the field. There can be misunderstandings that just get amplified as things move further and further away from the field. So our role in doing the remote sensing work that we do in these complex settings is really to have a clear understanding of what's happening on the ground and relaying it to our data partners, and then also kind of going in the other direction as well. But I think it is very helpful to have a clear idea that's very ground truthed when we're figuring out what data is required.
Got it. Laurent, anything you would want to add to this about the way, the difference between a shiny object and a tool?
Not necessarily. I think everything was said. I was also busy typing some answers in the other questions, which we might not be able to capture. But one thing I wanted to mention that you brought up, spectrum, and I think we also, I think we need ITU also to be a bit on our side, because I understand there are some risks involved in in giving away spectrum to 6G and all that we as Earth observation community start being a bit concerned about, especially if it starts affecting, X-band and downlinks and other things, and interference might happen. And Patricia, what we talk, and our director is quite concerned with that, and we all are. So I think we need to have a balance and make sure that Earth observation does not suffer from the expansion of telecommunication services. So please don't forget that, and don't forget us in those discussions, because as you mentioned, spectrum is very important, and this is again behind the scenes, but we cannot go without it. So, but nothing else to add on the other question. I think everything was said.
Luke, I'll give you one shot at this same question. But Dan, you had something you were going to add?
I just, yes, just quickly, something I absolutely should have added is that we really need the idea of confidence around all of the data products, particularly when we're starting to use machine learning or AI generated, for example, damage assessments. It's so important for us to have an understanding of what is the level of confidence on these assessments or on these data points. So that's a little bit more of there's been some level of processing, but that's really critical for our work in being able to use the data appropriately.
On validating for sort of confidence. Got it.
Yes.
Luke, I wanted to give you a chance to answer that same question, or just add your final thoughts. We're coming to the end of the hour, so something, maybe a quick contribution.
Just starting on what Danielle said, that is very important to understand the level of confidence of all this, let's say, analytical product that might be coming available, or they are already available, that are based on not only on Earth observation analysis, but also on artificial intelligence, data analytics. So the level of confidence is very important. And I will say also the predictability, and saying that certain let's say certain mechanisms, certain data might not be available consistently in areas where we operate, where we normally operate. So that is also, maybe they might be available in certain geographic areas that are probably for business, and then there is a lot of market, interest in developing for other businesses, all these tools and then products, but in areas that are maybe less, let's say, made for profit, I would say that these are not available. So predictability and the level of accuracy is very important.
Excellent. Wow, we have covered an enormous amount of topics today, and we're coming now to the end of our session, which sort of flew by. I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists, Laurent, Rebecca, Luca, and Danny, for sharing your insights and your real-world experiences so candidly. Your work literally saves lives and helps build a more resilient world. So thank you for that work and your dedication. I hope that this discussion can aid those listening in the steps to prepare for the unthinkable. I want to thank the ITU team that supports this Space Connect series, and all of you listening. Your engagement and thoughtful questions can demonstrate that this global commitment to leveraging space technology for humanitarian good. I mentioned early, but I hope you'll join us for our next Space Connect episode on Wednesday, July 9th. This will be a special episode, which is a live stream of these two space panels, being space-focused panels being held at the ITU's AI for Good Summit, which is being held July 8th through 11 in Geneva this year. One of the panels will be on how AI is being used on orbit to support space safety of satellites and other space missions and novel space operations. And the second is more related to this. It'll build on this discussion on how AI is helping to harness the vast pools of weather, environmental, and imagery data for good on Earth. I know I'm looking forward to moderating both of those in person and hope you'll join us. In the meantime, we'll be posting this video on all of the ITU social media channels, and the slides will be posted on the ITU Space Connect webpage. If you haven't watched our prior episodes of Space Connect, please do feel free to check them out online and share them with colleagues who you think might benefit from these insights. For now, I'll thank you all for this engaging discussion on how space technology is transforming humanitarian response and emergency management. Until next time, thank you all. Bye-bye.